The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of courtroom 302 as Marcus and Gloria Richardson made their way through the heavy wooden doors. At ages 75 and 73 respectively, they had deliberately chosen their attire for this particular day. Marcus wore an old, slightly oversized sweater vest over a wrinkled white shirt, while Gloria had picked out a modest floral dress that seemed straight from a thrift store rack. The couple shuffled slowly toward the benches, appearing exactly as they wanted to, just another elderly pair who had wandered into the wrong place. Judge William Harrison, newly appointed to the bench just 6 months ago, looked up from his papers with visible irritation. At 45, he had developed a reputation for running his courtroom with iron-fisted efficiency, showing little patience for those who didn't meet his exacting standards of professionalism. "We're not running a senior center here," he muttered, loud enough for the first 3 rows to hear. A few young attorneys snickered, but quickly composed themselves. The Richardsons' neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, was already seated in the front row. Her eyes lit up when she saw them, but Gloria subtly shook her head, reminding their friend to maintain the charade. They had spent weeks preparing for this moment, coaching Mrs. Jenkins to play her part perfectly. "All rise." The bailiff called out as Judge Harrison officially began the morning session. The judge's steel-gray eyes swept across the courtroom, lingering disapprovingly on the elderly couple. "First case," Judge Harrison announced, consulting his docket. "Jenkins versus Palmer Property Development. A dispute over land ownership and proposed construction." He peered over his reading glasses. "Are all parties present?" A sleek attorney in an expensive suit stood up. "James Wilson for Palmer Property Development, Your Honor." Mrs. Jenkins rose nervously. "I'm here, Your Honor. And I have." She gestured toward the Richardsons. Marcus slowly got to his feet, deliberately allowing a slight tremor in his hand as he gripped the bench in front of him. "We're here to help Mrs. Jenkins, Your Honor. She's our neighbor." Judge Harrison's face darkened. "And you are?" "Marcus Richardson, Your Honor. This is my wife, Gloria." The judge pinched the bridge of his nose. "Mr. and Mrs. Richardson, are you attorneys?" Gloria spoke up, her voice carrying just a hint of a quaver. "We've had some experience with legal matters, Your Honor." "This is a court of law, not a community center," Judge Harrison said sharply. "Mrs. Jenkins, I strongly advise you to seek proper legal representation. We can postpone today's proceedings to give you time to find a qualified attorney." The expensive lawyer from Palmer Property Development smirked. "Your Honor, my clients have already invested considerable time and resources. Another delay would be quite costly." Judge Harrison nodded. "I understand, Mr. Wilson. However," he turned back to the Richardsons, speaking slowly and loudly as if they were hard of hearing. "This is a complex legal matter. Do you understand what that means?" Gloria clutched her plastic shopping bag closer, playing her role perfectly. Inside, however, she was cataloging every condescending word and gesture. The bag didn't contain shopping items at all. Instead, it held detailed records of Judge Harrison's previous cases, showing a clear pattern of bias against elderly and minority defendants. Marcus shifted his weight, appearing uncertain. "We understand quite well, Your Honor. We're prepared to proceed." The judge laughed, not bothering to hide his disdain. "Very well. It's your neighbor's property at stake, not mine. Mr. Wilson, you may begin your opening statement." As the corporate lawyer launched into his practice speech, Marcus and Gloria exchanged a brief glance. They'd spent over 4 decades practicing law at the highest levels, arguing cases before the Supreme Court, and shaping civil rights legislation across the country. Now, watching Judge Harrison's dismissive attitude, they knew their instincts about him had been correct. Mrs. Jenkins fought to hide her smile. She'd seen the Richardsons in action before, back when they'd helped her church with a property dispute. She knew exactly what was coming, and it took all of her self-control not to give away the game. The corporate lawyer finished his opening statement with a flourish, clearly expecting the next few minutes to be nothing more than a formality. Judge Harrison turned to the Richardsons with an exaggerated expression of patience. "Now then," he said, as if speaking to children, "would you like to make an opening statement? Please try to keep it brief and simple." Marcus rose slowly to his feet, maintaining his elderly shuffle. The show was about to begin, and not a single person in that courtroom, except for Mrs. Jenkins, had any idea what was coming. The story of Marcus and Gloria Richardson's journey to legal excellence began in the fall of 1971, when they first crossed paths in the hallowed halls of Harvard Law School. Gloria Pierce, as she was known then, had been one of only 6 black women in her class, while Marcus was a former civil rights activist who had marched alongside Dr. King. Their first meeting happened in the law library late one evening. Gloria was buried in case studies when Marcus accidentally knocked over her stack of books. Instead of being annoyed, she found herself charmed by his sincere apology and brilliant insights into the case she was studying. That chance encounter turned into daily study sessions, which eventually blossomed into romance. Both Marcus and Gloria faced constant challenges during their time at Harvard. Some professors would deliberately call on them, hoping to prove they didn't belong. Other students would accidentally exclude them from study groups. But rather than breaking their spirit, these obstacles only fueled their determination. They graduated in 1974, with both of them finishing in the top 5 of their class. Gloria was first, Marcus was third, and their graduation made headlines in several black newspapers across the country. The young couple married that same summer, turning down lucrative offers from prestigious law firms in New York and Chicago. Instead, they moved to Atlanta, renting a tiny office above a barbershop. Their vision was clear. They wanted to build a civil rights law firm that would fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves. The early years were tough. They often worked 18-hour days, sometimes accepting payment in the form of home-cooked meals or handmade quilts. Their first major case came in 1976, when they represented a group of black farmers fighting against discriminatory lending practices. Despite facing a team of corporate lawyers, the Richardsons spent countless hours gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, and building an airtight case. Their victory set a legal precedent that would be cited in similar cases for decades to come. Throughout the 1980s, their reputation grew. Marcus became known for his brilliant legal strategy and powerful courtroom presence, while Gloria was feared for her ability to find overlooked details that could turn a case upside down. They won landmark cases involving voting rights, housing discrimination, and educational equality. By the 1990s, the Richardson Law Group had grown into one of the most respected civil rights firms in the South. They had a staff of 30 lawyers, but Marcus and Gloria still personally handled their most important cases. They'd argued 6 cases before the Supreme Court, winning 5 of them. Legal journals regularly published their opinions, and law schools used their cases as teaching materials. Marcus served as a federal judge from 1995 to 2005, earning a reputation for fairness and brilliant legal reasoning. His written opinions were studied in law schools across the country. Gloria, meanwhile, became the first black woman to serve as president of the Georgia Bar Association. Together, they created a scholarship program that helped hundreds of minority students attend law school. Even now, in their 70s, they hadn't slowed down. They still worked select cases, especially when they saw injustice that needed to be challenged. Their children had followed in their footsteps. Their daughter was now a federal prosecutor, and their son ran the day-to-day operations of the Richardson Law Group. The couple had developed a particular interest in monitoring judicial conduct after seeing too many judges abuse their power. They had a network of court watchers who would alert them to problematic behavior from judges. When they heard about Judge Harrison's pattern of discriminatory behavior, they knew they had to act. Mrs. Jenkins' case had provided the perfect opportunity. The property dispute was straightforward enough, but the judge's documented history of dismissing elderly and minority plaintiffs made it ideal for their purposes. They had spent weeks preparing, gathering evidence not just for Mrs. Jenkins' case, but also documenting Judge Harrison's pattern of biased behavior. Sitting in his courtroom now, watching him smirk at their deliberately shabby appearance, neither Marcus nor Gloria felt angry. They had faced far worse in their careers. Instead, they felt a familiar sense of purpose. This was why they had become lawyers in the first place, to challenge those who abused their power and to fight for justice. As Judge Harrison continued to make condescending remarks, Gloria squeezed her husband's hand under the table. After 47 years of marriage and legal partnership, they could communicate volumes with a single touch. This judge had no idea what was coming, but by the end of the day, he would learn a lesson he'd never forget. 3 months before the courtroom showdown, Marcus and Gloria Richardson sat in their home office, reviewing reports from their court monitoring network. The thick folder on Judge William Harrison made for disturbing reading. Page after page documented his pattern of dismissive behavior toward elderly plaintiffs and defendants of color. "Listen to this one," Gloria said, adjusting her reading glasses. He told a 68-year-old black woman that she should bring someone younger who can understand legal matters to represent her interests. She shook her head in disgust, and this was after learning she had a master's degree in business. Marcus leaned back in his leather chair, his fingers forming a temple under his chin, a habit he'd developed during his years on the federal bench. The problem isn't just his behavior. It's that no one's challenging him because he's careful to target people who can't fight back. Their investigation had been thorough. Over 6 months, they had collected sworn statements from court staff, transcripts of proceedings, and even recordings when available. The pattern was clear. Judge Harrison reserved his worst behavior for those he considered beneath him. That's when Mrs. Jenkins knocked on their door one Sunday afternoon after church. She was in tears, clutching a legal notice from Palmer Property Development. The company was trying to claim part of her land through a disputed property line, and the case had been assigned to none other than Judge Harrison. "This is it," Gloria had whispered to Marcus after Mrs. Jenkins left. "This is our chance to address this situation." The Richardsons spent weeks preparing their strategy. They knew that simply filing complaints about the judge's behavior wouldn't be enough. They needed to create a situation that would force him to confront his own prejudices. Mrs. Jenkins proved to be the perfect client for their plan. A retired school teacher with a sharp mind and good acting skills, she understood exactly what they were trying to achieve. They spent hours coaching her on how to play her role, making sure she knew when to appear nervous and when to stay quiet. Remember, Marcus told her during one preparation session, "You need to act surprised when we start citing legal precedents. Your reaction needs to be as genuine as possible." The Richardsons also carefully planned their own appearances. Gloria visited several thrift stores to find the right outfit, something that would make her look like a sweet, harmless grandmother rather than the legal powerhouse who had argued successfully before the Supreme Court multiple times. Marcus practiced shuffling his feet and making his hands tremble slightly. He spent hours in front of a mirror, perfecting the art of appearing confused and slightly lost. It was a far cry from his usual commanding courtroom presence, but that was exactly the point. They built their legal strategy just as meticulously. While appearing to bumble through the initial proceedings, they would lay careful traps in their arguments. Every seemingly innocent question would have a purpose, building toward the moment when they would reveal their true expertise. The corporate lawyers from Palmer Property Development played right into their hands. Convinced they were facing amateur opposition, they became sloppy with their documentation. Gloria spent late nights finding holes in their property surveys and inconsistencies in their permits. "They're not even bothering to hide their mistakes," she told Marcus one evening. "They think we won't know what to look for." A week before the court date, the Richardsons met with Mrs. Jenkins for final preparations. They rehearsed every detail, from where she would sit to how she would react when the judge made his inevitable condescending comments. "Just remember," Gloria advised, "this isn't just about your case anymore. This is about everyone who comes into his courtroom feeling scared and powerless." The morning of the court date, Marcus and Gloria woke up early. They had their usual breakfast, toast and coffee for him, oatmeal for her, while reviewing their strategy one final time. Before leaving their house, they changed into their carefully selected costumes. As they drove to the courthouse, Gloria reached over and squeezed Marcus's hand. "Ready to put on a show, husband?" Marcus smiled, thinking about the judge's likely reaction when he realized who was really standing in his courtroom. "After 50 years of practicing law, my dear, this might be our most important performance yet." They parked their car and slowly made their way toward the courthouse steps, already in character. Marcus shuffled slightly, while Gloria clutched her plastic shopping bag filled with meticulously prepared legal documents. The trap was set, and Judge Harrison was about to walk right into it. The corporate lawyer, Mr. Wilson, was in the middle of questioning his first witness, a land surveyor who was explaining why Mrs. Jenkins' property line was supposedly incorrect. Judge Harrison nodded approvingly at each point, occasionally glancing at the Richardsons with barely concealed amusement at their apparent confusion. Gloria sat quietly, pretending to knit while actually taking detailed mental notes of every technical error in the surveyor's testimony. And so, the surveyor concluded confidently. Based on the 1983 Municipal Rezoning Ordinance, the property line clearly falls where our new survey indicates. This was the moment Gloria had been waiting for. She carefully put away her knitting and raised her hand like a schoolchild. Judge Harrison rolled his eyes. "Yes, Mrs. Richardson," he said, speaking slowly and loudly. "Do you have a question?" Gloria stood up, maintaining her elderly woman act. "Yes, Your Honor. I'm a bit confused about something." She fumbled in her plastic shopping bag, producing a worn-looking folder. "I've been reading about property laws in my spare time, you see." Several lawyers in the courtroom smirked. Judge Harrison sighed heavily. "Mrs. Richardson, this is not a book club. If you have a relevant question—" "Oh yes," Gloria continued, her voice trembling slightly. "I was just wondering about the case of Henderson v. Atlanta Metropolitan Authority, 1962. Wouldn't that precedent invalidate any rezoning claims based on the 1983 ordinance, especially considering the grandfather clause regarding established property lines?" The courtroom fell silent. The smirk on Mr. Wilson's face flickered. Judge Harrison blinked, then frowned. "Mrs. Richardson," he said, his tone slightly less condescending, "are you familiar with that case?" "Oh my, yes," Gloria replied, still maintaining her elderly demeanor. "And then there's the matter of Watson v. Georgia State Planning Commission, 1975, which specifically addressed the issue of historical property markers in urban rezoning disputes." The surveyor on the witness stand started shifting uncomfortably. Mr. Wilson quickly stood up. "Your Honor, this line of questioning." But Marcus had apparently woken up from his doze. "If I might add," he said, his voice quavering perfectly, "the Supreme Court of Georgia's ruling in Douglas County v. Thompson, 1989, seems particularly relevant here." Judge Harrison's demeanor had shifted subtly. He was now looking at the elderly couple with increasing uncertainty. The case citations they were dropping were not just relevant, they were precisely on point. Gloria continued, her voice still gentle but now carrying an undercurrent of steel. "I'm also curious about the surveyor's use of the GPS coordinate system without accounting for the historical markers. The Martinez Doctrine clearly states—" Objection. Mr. Wilson was starting to sweat. "Your Honor, these people clearly don't have standing to—" "Actually," Marcus interrupted, his trembling hand pulling out a document from Gloria's shopping bag. "According to State Bar Rule 89.4, we have every right to assist our neighbor in this matter. Unless, of course, the court wishes to challenge the Georgia Supreme Court's ruling in Williams v. State Bar Association, 1991. Judge Harrison was now sitting up straighter, his expression a mixture of confusion and dawning realization. He had never seen anyone cite such specific and relevant cases without notes, let alone an elderly couple who appeared to have wandered in off the street. The corporate lawyer's witness was visibly uncomfortable, especially when Gloria began questioning the specifics of his surveying methodology. Each of her questions, asked in her sweet, grandmotherly voice, exposed another flaw in his work. "Your Honor," Mr. Wilson protested, "this is irregular." "What's irregular?" Marcus said, his voice suddenly stronger. "Is your client's failure to comply with Section 47 of the State Property Act regarding proper notification of adjacent landowners before conducting boundary surveys." Judge Harrison was now staring intently at the Richardsons, his earlier condescension replaced by growing suspicion. He had heard that precise legal citation before, in a famous property rights case from the federal courts. But surely these couldn't be. "Mrs. Richardson," he said carefully, "would you happen to be familiar with the Richardson doctrine of proportional property rights?" Gloria smiled sweetly. "Oh my, yes, Your Honor. Very familiar indeed." She paused, then added almost innocently, "Would you like me to explain its application to this case? I believe my husband might have some particular insights into its development." The color drained from Judge Harrison's face as the full reality of the situation began to dawn on him. This was not going to be the simple property dispute he had expected at all. The moment of truth arrived when Marcus Richardson slowly rose to his feet, deliberately letting his shopping bag fall open. Inside, instead of groceries, gleamed the gold-embossed spine of a legal textbook. Richardson's Federal Court Opinions, 1995 to 2005. "Your Honor," Marcus said, his voice no longer shaking, but now carrying the weight of decades on the federal bench. Perhaps we should address the fundamental constitutional issues at play here. Gone was the confused elderly man. In his place stood one of the most respected federal judges in American history. Judge Harrison's face had turned an interesting shade of pale. He recognized that book. He'd studied it in law school. In fact, he quoted from it numerous times in his own legal opinions. His eyes darted between the book and Marcus's face as recognition finally dawned. Judge Richardson, he managed to whisper, his voice barely audible in the now silent courtroom. Former federal judge Marcus Richardson, Marcus confirmed, straightening his posture to his full height. And beside me is my wife, Gloria Richardson, former president of the Georgia Bar Association and lead counsel in Henderson v. State Board of Education. The corporate lawyer, Mr. Wilson, dropped his pen. It clattered loudly in the silent courtroom. He had argued a case before Gloria Richardson early in his career and lost spectacularly. Now he understood why some of her earlier questions had seemed so familiar. Judge Harrison gripped his desk for support. But why are you? Why are we here dressed like this? Gloria finished for him, her own voice now crisp and professional. She pulled out a stack of documents from her shopping bag. Perhaps we should discuss your pattern of judicial conduct first, particularly regarding elderly and minority plaintiffs over the past 6 months. The young lawyers in the gallery began whispering among themselves. Many had their phones out, frantically Googling the Richardsons. Their eyes widened as they read about the couple's legendary legal careers. For the record, Marcus continued, I'd like to cite my own opinion in Thompson v. Federal District Court, 2003, regarding judicial conduct and equal protection under the law. He began quoting from memory. The bench must remain free from prejudice, whether overt or subtle, as justice knows no age, race, or social status. Judge Harrison's hands were visibly shaking as he shuffled through his papers. He had quoted that very opinion in his judicial confirmation hearing just 6 months ago. Gloria stood and walked toward the bench, her movements now precise and purposeful. Your Honor, we have here documented evidence of 17 instances in the past 6 months where elderly or minority plaintiffs were subjected to treatment that appears to violate the judicial code of conduct. The court reporter's fingers flew across her keyboard, trying to keep up with the dramatic turn of events. The bailiff stood with his mouth slightly open, watching the transformation of the seemingly confused elderly couple into legal titans. I had no idea, Judge Harrison stammered. That was rather the point, Marcus replied dryly. Though I must say, your comment about this not being a senior center was particularly memorable. He paused, letting the words sink in. I believe I heard something similar in 1974 when Gloria and I argued our first case. The judge in that instance was later removed from the bench. Mrs. Jenkins, still sitting quietly in her chair, allowed herself a small smile. She had watched the Richardsons work their magic before, but never quite like this. The corporate lawyer began gathering his papers. Your Honor, perhaps we could request a brief recess to what, Mr. Wilson? Gloria asked pleasantly. To prepare a defense against the improper survey your firm submitted as evidence, or to explain why you failed to follow proper notification procedures, she smiled. Please, do continue with your witness. I have several more questions about his methodology. Judge Harrison finally found his voice. I believe... He cleared his throat and started again. I believe we should take a 15-minute recess. He looked directly at the Richardsons. And perhaps we should discuss this matter in my chambers. Marcus nodded graciously. Of course, Your Honor. Though I suggest we complete the current witness's testimony first. After all, he added with a slight smile, we wouldn't want to waste the court's time. This isn't a senior center, as you mentioned earlier. The judge's face flushed red as his own words were quoted back to him. The transformation was complete. The seemingly confused elderly couple had revealed themselves as legal legends, and the entire dynamics of the courtroom had shifted dramatically. Rather than humiliate Judge Harrison further, Marcus and Gloria Richardson proceeded with their case with consummate professionalism. They had made their point. Now it was time to demonstrate true judicial excellence in action. Gloria rose to cross-examine the surveyor, her approach now methodical and precise. Gone was the wavering elderly voice, replaced by the calm, authoritative tone that had won her dozens of landmark cases. The surveyor, still rattled by the dramatic revelation of the Richardsons' true identities, stumbled through his explanation. With each question, Gloria systematically exposed the flaws in his work, but did so without antagonism or showmanship. Marcus watched his wife work with quiet pride. After 50 years together, her brilliance still amazed him. He noticed Judge Harrison leaning forward, studying Gloria's technique with growing respect and attention. When it was Marcus's turn to present Mrs. Jenkins' evidence, he did so with the measured precision that had made him famous during his years on the federal bench. He walked the court through each document, each historical record, building an airtight case for maintaining the original property lines. "Your Honor," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of decades of experience, "the precedent is clear. When historical property markers conflict with modern surveys, we must consider the entirety of the evidence, including historical usage and community understanding." The corporate lawyers from Palmer Property Development were now frantically taking notes. Several of them had apparently realized they were witnessing a master class in property law, taught by two of the most respected legal minds in the country. Judge Harrison, to his credit, was showing signs of genuine learning. His questions became more thoughtful, his attention more focused on the legal arguments rather than the appearances of those presenting them. The transformation in his demeanor was subtle but clear to the experienced eyes of the Richardsons. During the afternoon session, Gloria presented a series of community testimonies about the property line's historical usage. She could have been aggressive, pointing out how the judge had initially dismissed these as irrelevant stories from unqualified witnesses. Instead, she presented each testimony with dignity, demonstrating their legal significance with clear references to established precedent. As the Supreme Court noted in Williams v. Henderson, she explained, her voice warm but authoritative, community understanding of property boundaries, particularly in historically underserved neighborhoods, carries significant weight in property dispute resolution. Marcus followed with a brilliant analysis of state property law, delivering what amounted to a perfect lecture on the evolution of property rights in Georgia. Young lawyers in the gallery had abandoned all pretense of working on other cases and were openly taking notes. The judge's discomfort had gradually transformed into genuine engagement. When he asked questions now, they were thoughtful and relevant, showing a real interest in the legal principles being discussed. By late afternoon, the corporate lawyers were looking increasingly defeated. Their case, which had seemed so simple in the morning, had been systematically dismantled by two legal legends who had appeared in the guise of a harmless elderly couple. "Your Honor," Marcus said as the day drew to a close, "we have one final exhibit." He produced a document that made the judge's eyes widen. It was his own ruling from a similar case 2 months ago, where he had dismissed an elderly plaintiff's property claim without full consideration. But instead of using it to embarrass the judge, Marcus pointed out elements of that ruling that actually supported Mrs. Jenkins' case. "Your own analysis here, Your Honor, about the importance of historical contexts in property disputes is particularly relevant to our current situation." The judge sat back, understanding the subtle message. The Richardsons were offering him a way to rule correctly while maintaining his dignity. They could have humiliated him, could have filed formal complaints about his behavior, but instead, they chose to teach by example. As the sun began to set outside the courtroom windows, Gloria gathered her documents with practiced efficiency. She and Marcus had accomplished something more important than just winning a case. They had potentially changed a judge's perspective on elderly and minority plaintiffs. The lesson had been delivered not through confrontation or shame, but through a masterful demonstration of what true legal excellence looked like. As they prepared for their closing arguments the next day, the Richardsons knew that regardless of the case's outcome, their real goal had already been achieved. The next morning, the courtroom was packed. Word had spread about the previous day's events, and every seat was filled with lawyers, law students, and curious courthouse staff eager to witness the conclusion of this remarkable case. Judge Harrison entered the courtroom looking different, humbled but also more dignified. His usual swagger was replaced by a thoughtful demeanor as he took his seat at the bench. The Richardsons, no longer playing at being confused elderly people, sat with the natural grace of seasoned legal professionals. "Before we proceed with closing arguments," Judge Harrison began, his voice carrying a new note of sincerity, "I want to acknowledge the exceptional level of legal expertise we've witnessed in this courtroom. He paused, making eye contact with both Marcus and Gloria. It has been educational. Gloria delivered the closing argument for Mrs. Jenkins. She stood tall, her voice clear and compelling as she wove together the evidence, precedents, and testimonies into an irrefutable narrative. The corporate lawyers from Palmer Property Development shifted uncomfortably in their seats as she systematically dismantled their case. Your Honor, Gloria concluded, the evidence clearly shows that Mrs. Jenkins' property line has been established and recognized for over 60 years. Any attempt to alter it now based on questionable survey methods would not only violate legal precedent, but would also undermine the very principles of property rights that our courts are meant to protect. Mr. Wilson's closing argument for Palmer Property Development felt weak in comparison. His earlier confidence had evaporated, and he frequently stumbled over his words, especially when trying to explain away the irregularities in their survey methodology. When both sides had finished, Judge Harrison took a brief recess to consider his verdict. The tension in the courtroom was palpable during the 15-minute wait. Mrs. Jenkins sat calmly, holding Gloria's hand, while Marcus reviewed his notes one final time. Upon returning to the bench, Judge Harrison's expression was resolute. After careful consideration of all evidence presented, this court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Mrs. Jenkins. His voice grew stronger as he continued. The attempted property line adjustment by Palmer Property Development is hereby rejected, and the historical boundary shall remain in place. The judge then did something unusual. He began citing specific arguments that the Richardsons had made, acknowledging their legal brilliance while delivering his verdict. As Judge Richardson correctly noted in his analysis of historical property rights, he said at one point, causing several young lawyers in the gallery to furiously scribble notes. After the verdict was read, Mrs. Jenkins hugged both Richardsons, tears of joy streaming down her face. The corporate lawyers quickly gathered their things and left, their expensive suits somehow looking less impressive than they had the day before. As the courtroom began to clear, Judge Harrison descended from the bench and approached the Richardsons. His face showed a mixture of embarrassment and genuine respect. Judge Richardson, Mrs. Richardson, he said quietly, I owe you both an apology. My behavior yesterday morning was, he struggled to find the right words, was quite educational for everyone involved, Marcus finished diplomatically. I would very much appreciate the opportunity to speak with you both in my chambers, the judge continued. There are clearly some aspects of judicial conduct that I need to, he paused again, reconsider. Gloria shared a knowing look with her husband before responding. We would be happy to have that discussion, Your Honor. As they prepared to move to the judge's chambers, the remaining observers in the courtroom watched with interest. Many had never seen a judge admit to his mistakes so publicly, nor witnessed such a masterful handling of both the legal and human elements of justice. Mrs. Jenkins caught Gloria's hand one more time before they left. Thank you, she whispered. Not just for me, but for everyone who'll come into this courtroom after me. Gloria squeezed her hand in return. That was the whole point, dear. The Richardsons gathered their belongings, no longer hiding their documents in shopping bags, and followed Judge Harrison toward his chambers. They had won more than just a property dispute. They had potentially transformed a judge's entire approach to justice. As they walked through the courthouse corridors, younger lawyers stopped to watch them pass, many now recognizing the legendary couple who had orchestrated one of the most masterful legal lessons ever witnessed in that courthouse. The verdict was in, but the real impact of their performance would be felt in that courtroom for years to come. In Judge Harrison's chambers, Marcus and Gloria Richardson sat across from the humbled judge, a thick folder of documents between them on his mahogany desk. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, illuminating decades. These are copies of transcripts from your courtroom over the past 6 months. Gloria explained gently, opening the folder. We've highlighted patterns of behavior that raised concerns. She slid several papers across the desk, each showing instances where elderly or minority plaintiffs had received dismissive treatment. Judge Harrison reviewed the documents, his face growing more troubled with each page. I didn't realize, he began, then stopped, looking up at the Richardsons. I thought I was being efficient, maintaining order in my courtroom. I didn't see the bias in my own actions. Marcus leaned forward, his voice carrying the wisdom of his years on the federal bench. Understanding our own biases is the first step toward true justice. When I first became a judge, an older colleague gave me similar feedback. It changed my entire approach to the law. Instead of filing formal complaints that could have ended Harrison's career, the Richardsons offered something more valuable: mentorship. They proposed meeting regularly to review his cases and discuss approaches to ensuring equal justice for all who entered his courtroom. "We've been watching your rulings," Gloria noted. "You have a sharp legal mind, Your Honor. But excellence in law isn't just about knowing statutes and precedents. It's about seeing the humanity in every person who stands before you." Over the next 6 months, a remarkable transformation took place in courtroom 302. Judge Harrison began holding regular sessions with the Richardsons, reviewing his cases and decisions. The changes in his courtroom demeanor were subtle but significant. He started taking more time with elderly plaintiffs, ensuring they fully understood the proceedings. His tone became more patient, his questions more thoughtful. When dealing with minority defendants, he made sure they had proper representation and understood their rights. The legal community noticed the change. Lawyers who had once dreaded appearing in his courtroom found themselves before a different kind of judge, one who combined efficient proceedings with genuine respect for all parties. 1 year after the Mrs. Jenkins case, Judge Harrison was handling a property dispute remarkably similar to the one that had brought the Richardsons into his courtroom. The plaintiff was an elderly Vietnamese woman who spoke limited English. Instead of showing irritation at the need for a translator, he ensured she had proper representation and that every detail was clearly explained to her. The Richardsons, sitting in the back of the courtroom that day, exchanged satisfied smiles. Their performance had evolved into something far more meaningful than they had initially planned. During their final mentoring session, Judge Harrison shared something personal. "My grandfather was a sharecropper," he revealed. "He never got justice in the courts. Somewhere along the way, I forgot that history. I became part of the system I once wanted to change." Gloria reached across the desk and patted his hand. "But now you're changing it from the inside, one case at a time." The impact of the Richardsons' intervention extended beyond just one judge. Other judges in the district, hearing about the transformation in courtroom 302, began examining their own conduct. The courthouse instituted new training programs on implicit bias and equal justice, with Judge Harrison often sharing his own experience as a cautionary tale. Mrs. Jenkins' property line remained intact, but the real victory was the lasting change in the justice system. Young lawyers who witnessed the case still talked about it years later, not just about the brilliant legal arguments, but about the wisdom of using knowledge to educate rather than humiliate. In their home office, the Richardsons added a framed newspaper article about the case to their wall of achievements. Unlike their other accolades, this one didn't mention their names. Instead, it simply described how an elderly couple had transformed the judge's understanding of justice. "Think we should do it again?" Marcus asked his wife one evening, looking at the article. Gloria smiled, squeezing his hand. "Let's see what our court watchers report. There's always another judge who could use a visit from a confused elderly couple with a surprising knowledge of constitutional law." And so, the Richardsons continued their work, proving that sometimes the most powerful changes come not from confrontation, but from wisdom, patience, and the willingness to teach rather than condemn. Their legacy lived on not just in legal textbooks, but in the daily operations of a justice system that had learned to see the dignity in every person who sought its protection.